Hello and welcome. You're with the Economic Times, and we are back with you with the series that we've been continuously, regularly bringing you. Accenture presents the Economic Times CEO Breakfast series, and we're talking today about the digital supply chain roundtable. No business has been left untouched by the unprecedented crisis caused by the COVID-19. The scale of the impact may vary, but every business has had to go back to the drawing board to rework and reimagine, their plans, both for the near term as well as for the long term. It is also an opportunity for businesses to aggressively digitize their supply chain infrastructure. You can call it the heart of any business, and that helps build operational efficiencies and achieve better business outcomes as well. Suddenly, every company wants to move aggressively ahead to digitize their supply chain infrastructure. While that seems to be unfolding, there could be another challenge lurking around the corner. A possible third wave, if it hits businesses and people in general, adds to the current uncertainty, pushing the digital supply chain agenda a little further. So, where there is a crisis, there is also an opportunity. Businesses are looking to use this opportunity to build a strategic advantage over others and try and move very aggressively ahead, particularly through the larger companies. There may be another factor in the changes that are crystallizing. The rapidly unfolding EV revolution is adding to the extra element of change, with several industries having to re-engineer and reimagine their supply chains. So you won't want to miss this conversation with such eminent people who are joining. And I'll just tell you who they are in a minute. And they'll be talking about the digitization of the supply chain infrastructure. So let me introduce the guests today that we have, and they'll be speaking to you today. First, let me invite Ashwath Ram, Managing Director, Cummins India and Tata Cummins, to join us. Welcome, Ashwath. I'll also request Soumitra Bhattacharya, Managing Director of Bosch, to join us today. We also have Atul Thakkar, Managing Director, Minusha India, formerly RICO, if you're familiar with the name. Manish Bhatnagar, Managing Director, SKF India, also is joining us. We also have to lend that expert edge, Anand Darbe, Managing Director, Strategy and Consulting, Accenture in India, and Raghu Gunapalli, Managing Director, Industrial Lead, Growth Markets, Accenture in India. So that's the lineup today with all the experts that we have today. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for taking out the time. Welcome, and I look forward to an interesting 90 minutes of conversations with all of you, and look forward to hearing about your expertise, your experience, and draw upon that as well. But first, let me invite and request Raghu if he can do a welcome address for everyone, please.
Thank you, Ashutosh, for setting the stage with the video and the introductions. Firstly, I would like to thank all the esteemed panelists. I know most of you have taken time out from your busy schedules to share your perspectives in this forum. Really appreciate the gesture. Thank you once again for making the time. And like Ashutosh said, we are living in extraordinary times after, I would say, what's been a bruising 12 to 15 months experience for the automotive industry. The sector is now entering what I think is a rapid and exciting growth phase. And even as I say that, I'll keep my fingers crossed, and let's hope there are no significant shocks ahead, at least in the immediate future. And I must admit, about 12 months back, when we at Accenture asked ourselves, what are the 2 or 3 most important priorities that CEOs in the automotive sector are grappling with, we talked about a few things. We talked about the mega trends disrupting the automotive sector. 100+ years old business model getting upended, with digital technologies driving significant changes in every aspect of the automotive value chain, including the core product and its components. We talked about digitization journeys to transform the front end customer experience, sales, service, marketing. We talked about automotive players embarking on a whole new wave of technology journeys to transform its businesses. We also talked about supply chain and the need to build agility, the need to build flexibility and resilience in the automotive supply chains. We realized supply chain is an important issue, but I must admit, we did not expect this to become so central and so topical so soon. It's been fascinating actually to see many of our clients looking at addressing questions around how to build next generation supply chains, if I may call that, supply chains that will help industry players emerge from the bruising impact of the pandemic, supply chains that will support the ambitious bounce back and growth expected over the next few months and years, supply chains that will start pivoting, if I may use that word, towards a new paradigm, which will see a growing share of electric vehicles. So it's been an interesting few weeks and months ideating with our clients on these topics. And I'm looking forward to the discussion today to hear more, from this August gathering here on where and how they see the big challenges when it comes to supply chains and what they're doing to address them. So with that, back to you, Ashutosh.
Thank you so much, Raghu, for putting for that note. First question, and I'd like to address it to Manish. With the kind of business that you're in, you literally make sure that the wheels of the economy are moving in the smallest possible way, but the biggest ones need that. Give us a sense of the changes that have happened over the last 18 months or so. Some of them may be forced, some of them very consciously taken.
Yeah, it's been a very crazy, I don't like to use the word unprecedented, it's been overused. It's been a very, very crazy last 18 months. And supply chains, as we knew it 18 months ago, have just been turned on their heads today. What was important then, you go back January 2020, we were focused on efficiency. So how do we have efficient supply chains? And that led to global interconnectedness, just-in-time inventory, and everything that was geared towards efficiency. Now it's about resilience. And it's the exact opposite of what we thought was important then. I mean, it's important now, for example, of building buffers in the inventory system. I wouldn't even have thought of it 15 months ago. It's very different. And the big change we are seeing is that what we used to think was a linear supply chain, the old classic model of design, plan, manufacture, deliver, collect cash, has now become extremely interconnected, very dynamic. And this is a great topic. Digital is at the core of this new interconnected, very dynamic supply chain. It's no longer linear. If you're living in the linear age, you're probably dead by now.
Oh, that's very strong words. Ashwath Ram, what has this period looked like for you? And again, as we prepare for takeoff, how are you re-engineering the supply chain to make sure you're relevant and very much within, running smoothly with the business?
It has been quite disruptive, and the industry I'm involved in works with many parts, and the supply chain is truly global. So it takes over 1,500 parts to make a diesel engine, and these parts come from multiple countries around the world. And even we pride ourselves and talk a lot about having localized a lot, and having over 90% of our parts made in India. And despite that, we've had quite a few challenges to meet the demand of our customers. And all that is because, like I said, the whole global supply chain is so interconnected, and it's far more complicated than what it used to be. And so, as Manish said, that we are having to use technologies. Earlier, you used to have 2 or 3 really smart guys who would sit on their spreadsheets and know who to call, when to call, what kind of part to keep the inventory on, and it's no longer possible to do those kinds of things. Even traditional databases and ERP systems are failing us in being able to predict where the next disruption is going to come in, and that's where we are looking into some of the advanced technologies of AI and machine learning, because we are faltering with what the existing supply chain technologies are providing us. So I would say I'm very optimistic. We have managed to keep the ship running and we have emerged stronger, but we are certainly going to have to revamp the supply chain and make it better, because the future, at least in my view, holds a lot more complexity and many more of these kinds of unpredicted disruptions.
Okay, challenging times ahead. Now, just like you probably keep an eye on Caterpillar to have a sense of the global economy, you probably need to have one eye on Bosch globally because the kind of size it has. So let's ask Soumitra for the changes that he is seeing and the changes that you expect over the next maybe year or two, which will take the agenda of the digital supply chain ahead. Soumitra.
Thanks a lot, Ashutosh. Like my other panelists, I see a red thread in what they have spoken. So I'd just like to bring a few additional points. The first point is that the traditional supply chain systems, if I take India linked to the world, that itself, not only for our company, but I believe for most companies in India, needs tremendous strengthening, because of the source, make, deliver, the digitization, and not in silos, but across a common glue, and very important, obsessive collaboration with others, because you can't create, beautiful islands of your own. And collaboration requires also the soft factor of trust. So it's not just hard data, it's data, plus it's also trust, leadership, and a vision to prepare the soil well. Having said that, COVID also brings the second part, which is the only certainty is uncertainty. So if you take now supply chains where very small parts can completely disrupt, and this is what's happening today in the automotive industry, a $2 part can completely disrupt the whole industry, and not just in India, but across the world, or industries, not just auto, perhaps electronics and others. So it gives you a very clear message that certainty, the only certainty being uncertainty, the aspect of in India, we need to really leapfrog on sustainable digital supply chains, not individual companies, but across all whom we work, not just at make. Most companies have done a lot of good work on make, but on source and deliver. And finally, the world is a global village. So I would say Bosch, if we look at, we operate in 150 countries, but manufacture in more than 50. And in India, we manufacture in 8 different states with 16 different plants. And we are seeing this in great, and I don't think this is going away. So finally, no quick fix, there to stay, prepare the soil, and of course, look at all aspects.
Okay, so that's what the uncertainty looks like, and that's the only certainty. Let me now go across to Anand Dalbe and ask him about what are some of those capabilities that auto players, and since he's speaking in that context a little bit, that they need to build to address these challenges, and how will the digital supply chain ensure that it can happen? Anand.
Hi, good morning. Yes, I think very interesting conversation. I think everyone is agreeing that supply chains, as we knew, would not help us face the challenges that lie ahead, and also capture the opportunity that lie ahead, right? And what the pandemic really did was a lot of these capabilities that many organizations knew they had to build at some point in time. I think it has accelerated their importance and the need to do them pretty much front and center on the table as of today. So I think if I look at it broadly, there are 4 or 5 key capabilities the way I see it. I think one is really enhancing the end-to-end visibility, right? I think what is clearly happening, and this is across again 2 dimensions. Not only internally, when we look at it internally, is across organizations. You have the fulfillment, procurement, manufacturing, and all of those functions. Typically, planning as a function also is sort of evolving in its stature. It's typically not been an evolved function in many organizations. We see that elevating and driving a lot of conversations now. And really, how do you build a single source of truth of visibility of what's happening internally across the functions? But I think more importantly, the other dimension of visibility is also across the external partners, right? And as Soumitra rightly pointed out, collaboration and looking at other partners and the ecosystem is also very important. So externally, clearly suppliers are absolutely the key part. So how do we really understand the risks that we have in that supply chain, improve the visibility there, be it with the logistics providers, the 3PL partners, and so on and so forth. So one is really the visibility internally and externally. I think second is clearly, given this uncertainty, traditionally understanding demand better is probably a capability that was underinvested in by the industry. It's relied on dealer inputs, the expertise of sales folks, and so on and so forth. And I think that as a capability driven more by technologies, data, not only the internal and structured data that exists within the organization, but the external and unstructured data around the macroeconomic variables, the softer aspects, what's trending on, the inquiries on social media, and how can we leverage all of that. So really getting closer to demand, understanding demand better is really the second capability that I would highlight is coming to the fore. And clearly a lot of analytical technologies are helping in that. I think the third, and this is also one of the very important shifts that has happened in this pandemic, is the whole granularity with which we plan and the linkage between planning and execution. I think both have changed fundamentally. I think we had our horizons of monthly, 2-monthly rolling plans. We've now understood the importance of weekly and daily. So this whole monthly to weekly to daily shift that has happened is more a permanent shift, which will need a lot more details when we plan, a lot more detailed understanding of inputs, and that typically beyond a point will be very physical, very challenging to do manually on Excel sheets, right? You wouldn't be able to get all those constraints and really look at the plans at that level of frequency and that level of granularity on a manual basis. And I think the second is also the linkage of the plan with the execution. So how does a production planning is linking into your scheduling and what's happening on the shop floor? How is material planning more strongly linking with suppliers, et cetera, et cetera. So I think the whole granularity is shifted and the frequency of planning has shifted, which is really caught on to bringing more technologies to manage this better. I think just a couple more. One is really the scenario planning and what if capabilities, right? I think fundamentally, we used to have more at max a base plan and optimistic and pessimistic. And I think last 15 months have really showed us that there are multitude of plans that scenarios that can play out. And honestly, not a scenario which is also at a single level of country, right? There will be different regions which will experience different scenarios basis what could happen. So really, how do you first understand these scenarios, look at their implications, look at not only their supply chain implications, but look at their financial implications. And really that is what is coming out as the next key capability. And also, I think the last one is really how do you build a capability to zoom in and zoom out. I mean, we are looking at supply chains, the overall footprints, and the long term, and then there is a lot happening at the short term. How do you build capabilities to move in and out to ensure that all these decisions are constantly being taken, reviewed, modified, refined, and being in sync? So I think these are the 5 key things which we are seeing, which are very, very critical as organizations start building these things. And obviously, digital technologies play a very, very critical role in it.
I guess so that it will be at the heart of the changes that are happening, and companies will need to do that. Okay, let's get a sense of that. And Atul Thakkar from Minosha, India, and just again repeat, earlier called RICO. So Atul, very interesting that you're taking your product and services to deep inside India's heartland, and that could be a harbinger of change in the coming years as well.
Yeah, Ashu, I feel the new paradigm will be as countries develop the remote and the rural areas where we will have to efficiently deliver goods and services. So, as I was mentioning, we are doing a project for the government of India where we are providing services to more than 130,000 remote government offices. And while we have been able to manage that, I still feel that last mile delivery or the infrastructure has to improve a lot. I mean, we see that improvement happening, and in the near future, we will see much better delivery issues being, all our delivery issues being addressed. But right now, we are having those issues. So, those are the challenges which we see at the infrastructure level, at the last mile. And what the previous panelists were saying, we also realized we had a very benign outlook, global trade outlook and deliveries. We could plan it to 80. But now we are having to discuss and interact with our tier 2 and tier 3 suppliers. I mean, it's very imperative that we are in continuous discussions to know whether our first level supplier will be able to maintain his schedule. So those, I think, are challenges which we all are facing. And as Manish said, buffering. I'm looking at a very elevated cost of inventory, carrying our inventories, because at every level we will need buffers, at least for the next 2-3 quarters. We will have to have buffers in place. So the just-in-time concept has been kept to the side right now. We are all using buffers. We are all not being that lean in our inventory planning. So those are the challenges and the issues which we are facing.
Okay, that's an interesting way things are panning out, and this could be deep inside India, as I mentioned. Okay, let me also ask Raghu about some of the key shifts that the industry and particularly the automakers are seeing, and in terms of what is making them revisit some of their plans. And it's important because that 100-year-old history is being changed and rewritten, so to say, Raghu.
Yeah. So I think the overarching, if you look at what's happening in the industry, there is an overarching structural change that's happening, and it's driven by these 4 technologies. There is, of course, electrification. There is shared mobility. There is connectivity, and there is autonomous driving. And at least 3 of these are already playing out in India. And this overarching structural change is anyway there, and the industry was grappling with this. And as that structural change was being acted upon, and there are 3 or 4 big things from a supply chain which are playing out. I think the dramatic changes in demand that we've seen over the last 12 to 18 months. I think most automotive supply chains over the years have been built for a certain demand pattern and a certain level of elasticity, with incremental or at least predictable changes in demand patterns. And if a year back, most supply chains in the automotive sector were suffering or grappling with a negative demand shock, they are today grappling to handle a positive demand shock. And the industry and its supply chain are not used to these kinds of dramatic declines or surges in demand. So that's one big thing. The next thing is really shortages around key components, and some of our panelists talked about it. I think increasingly trade flow restrictions and changes, some driven by the pandemic, and some driven by maybe new geopolitical equations that are emerging, it will lead to some big changes in the supply-demand dynamics, as well as we're already seeing pricing for some components or category groups. For supply chains that anyway have their hands full handling demand-side shocks, they're also now having to deal with supply-side shocks, from their own suppliers. Then there is, of course, the growing complexity in supply chains and networks. Learnings from the pandemic are forcing most automotive organizations, especially those with global footprints, to relook at their supply chain configurations, strategically look at de-risking to factor geography as well as political risks. And this has a cascading impact, not just on the global players with the global footprints, but this has a cascading impact on regional as well as country-specific players. And then finally, there is electrification, and we touched upon this. And it's electrification by itself is driving a whole new component supply chain, an ecosystem which is almost evolving as you go. There are, of course, incumbents and who are trying to pivot their business, and then there are players who are trying to disrupt the incumbents through technology-based differentiation or otherwise. And both these sets of players, the incumbents and the disruptors, are looking to capture what is fast becoming a shifting, if I can use the word, a shifting profit pool in the industry. It remains to be seen how the dust settles on this front, and I suspect we are at least a few years away from seeing a new industry order. So all in all, I think the multiple shifts, it's an industry in the midst of huge transformative changes. So interesting times ahead for all of us.
Interesting. I wonder, there might also be that risk that some of those companies may carry. Interesting is probably an understatement, I guess. Manish, over the last several months, besides the obvious, what are some of those challenges that you've had, more than challenges, the shocks that you've had to deal with, that gives you a sense of what could be coming in the coming months and coming years?
Yeah, I really liked, I think it was Anand who talked about how do we look at demand with higher integrity, with more deep diving. And I think it was Atul who talked about going deep into the supplier base, going to tier 2, tier 3. Both of those are new for many companies and certainly for us. And that's, again, the shift from a linear supply chain to a more interconnected supply chain, because it needs a very different way of working. Think of, I think Raghu talked of component shortages. Think of, we make bearings, right? So the biggest part, our material cost, the biggest part of that cost is steel. So we would go and work with steel mills and figure out how to ensure steel supply. But who would have thought that we would now need to go in and secure oxygen supply for those steel mills? I wouldn't even have thought of it 2 years ago, because suddenly now there are unrelated industries competing for the same components. Oxygen is being used by the healthcare industry and the steel industry. It's so important to secure that. Semiconductor chips are being used by auto guys and by personal computers. Who would have thought? You think of people on this call now, who are we competing? If I was an airline, I'm not competing with other airlines, I'm competing with Zoom. So it's just this whole concept of who are we competing with? And therefore, who are the suppliers we need to work with? That has gone through a significant different way of looking at supplies and supply bases. On the demand side, likewise, I think we are so dependent on sales people's giving forecasts, and that forecast then feeding through an S&OP process into supply chain, manufacturing, etc. Very often, that time delay between those forecasts and execution, that time delay was, could be at best 2 weeks, at worst 2 months. But what we are facing now is this complete compression of time and space. What used to hold good for 2 months earlier, frankly, holds good for 2 days now. So again, that needs a very different way of looking at data, a very different way of interacting with customers and suppliers. And I think I don't have all the answers, and I think we are all still grappling with it. how do we go in this new journey about all the things, demand, suppliers, compression of time, compression of space, new competitors. It's brand new for us. So these are some of the challenges, Ashu, we are facing. And I think we are figuring out together here.
Well, that's quite a situation to be in, Soumitra. At your perch, how do you look at some of those? Because Manish is suggesting, one, everyone is in it together. How, from your perch, are you looking at it? And what could be this? What could drive the agility that is needed in terms of hoping things are in control for you?
Thanks again, Ashutosh. I'll take this question and I'll try to use it with one particular example, which all of us know, the semiconductor crisis. Now, semiconductors have changed the way we all work. It's a small component. It's a very intelligent component. It goes through a back end and a front end. The wafer fab manufacturers and the ASIC manufacturers are few. They are located in different parts of the world and a very complex supply chain. And normally it is tier 2 to the OEMs. So they supply to the tier 1s like us and others, and then it goes to the OEMs. Now, who would have thought that, when the pandemic broke last year, that semiconductors would be an issue? But what the pandemic did was we all started using more laptops, more iPads, more phones, and the automotive industry shut down. So the whole automotive industry also shut down the orders. And then there was a surge. So that's why I come back. The only certainty, uncertainty. Now, these parts are just a few dollars, but they have a huge supply chain. They're very intelligent, and they can actually stop various industries. And today, worldwide, not just India, again, I repeat, they have actually massively shut down or crippled or even reduced the capacities of automotive manufacturers to manufacture cars for a small component. Now, these components you can't change overnight. It takes 3 years to put up a fab factory, and it takes 9 months minimum to a year to even change a ASIC, and sometimes even more. So you can't shut it down, you can't reopen something, and you can't change the component that you look because it's completely personalized. Now, this simple matter, which is actually very complex, then gets further complicated because of what rightly, we heard that geopolitical situations, the world has gone into decoupling. China and America are at loggerheads and even more, and that makes a big change in the world. India is at a different plane as compared to being aligned. We don't have any back end or front end. We have, capacities to do ECUs, and Bosch has a huge ECU plant, but not semiconductors. So we are totally dependent. And then if you look at snowstorms, fires, and latest COVID, which can shut down many of these semiconductor, either front end or back end, imagine the permutation combinations that you're living in one small part. So, and then this small part can have a reeling effect on the whole industry. Like all our colleagues said, you start building inventory, but till how long will we build inventory? Till what levels are we going to build buffers? And for which parts? And then you have a cascading effect down to the raw material, the steel, the basic parts, and who holds what inventories from finished goods of cars down to the basic raw materials, and at what levels can you have the certainty that this is going to come back into order in an unpredictable demand and supply world for the end product. So I would just endorse by saying this has brought all the theory out of whatever we've learned. Management has to be on its toes, have humility to talk about vulnerability, share obsessively the truth, not only within the organizations. Now in India, we are not good at this now. To be obsessively collaborative even with our competitors. And to be able to talk about the reality, and sometimes the truth hurts, and then work around fast, both as a process, but also as organizations. So I just shared this example, and it's just the tip of the iceberg.
Okay, so the complexity, it only increases. A changing technology, changing world order, changing business. And then, Ashwath, we're trying to introduce that dash, and well, more than just a dash of, intelligence in the supply chain. How do you work differently then in a situation which is so uncertain?
No, it's pretty complicated. And before I start the answer, I just want to say that I'm struggling a little bit with some connectivity problems, and so if I go off, I'll do my best to be back as quickly as possible. So
That's
coming
another
back to
complexity in today's world.
absolutely. So coming back to the complex, the complex is going to get a lot more complicated, and that's why when sometimes I'm talking about a parallel issue when we talk about things like Atmanirbhar Bharat, etc. It's difficult to get to that kind of complete independence unless you think about all the complexity. Many of us who till now looked at a lot of these electronics as little black pieces of boxes which we just buy from somewhere now have had to learn and understand the level 2, level 3 portions of the supply chain lot more. So what we found out after painfully was that the entire automotive industry's requirement of these chips makes up less than 4% of the demand for some of these fab shops. We have no fab shop in the entire country, and it takes 3 or 4 years, as Soumitra said, to even set up a basic fab shop. So as a nation, we are going to have to do some, long-term planning and thinking. We are going to have to say, do we really want to be that independent nation, or do we want to build those alliances? And does it make sense for us to invest in some of these technologies as a country? Does the entire industry come together and pool and do some of these things? And what happens when the barriers go up and countries with deeper pockets than us start to buy a lot of this? Like if for example, one of the reasons why a lot of the semiconductor problems exist is because China felt threatened by the United States, allowing access to some of this technology, and they went up and bought a whole bunch of capacity from the manufacturers around the world. So what kind of role do we have to play when we are such a small portion of that supply chain? So we just have to think and plan on all of these things. It does mean that the linear thinking that we were thinking about, looking at one piece of data or two pieces of data, no longer makes any sense. We have to put in systems which are learning continuously, which are working 24/7, which are based on inputs coming in from multiple nations around the world. And that is where some of the newer technologies in AI and machine learning are coming into effect, to look at patterns that human beings are not able to understand, but looking at the math of the complex disruptions happening around the world and thinking what's going to happen 12 or 14 months down the line, and being able to take some of those risk decisions. So yeah, it's getting more complicated, but I guess it's still extremely scientific, and the industry still continues to work at greater than 60-70% of its ability. So I think I am always looking at the bright side of things, that we'll figure this out. We'll put in more capacities around the world in the next couple of years, and we'll come out of these problems.
Okay, interesting. There is already so much of talk of investments. Samsung putting up a plant in the US, and of course South Korea looking to expand some of it. Anyway, that's a different discussion, but there are some questions coming in. So just want to tell the audience that's watching that you can keep the questions coming in and we'll try and toss them to the experts here so that you can get them answered. So some are coming in. So if I can read out the question and maybe ask one of them. So here's one from Kamal Sharma, which says, how to manage quality of product in localization of product in India. We found that managing consistent quality product is a big challenge for Indian supplier. Please suggest if you have an idea. Maybe if I can ask Manish, if you can go. I mean, this is a slightly generic question, but if you can answer that, please.
Sure, I'll try. It is a very generic question. It goes beyond just digital supply chains. This is about quality metrics, supply reliability, everything that we all know very well. And I hate to give one size fits all answer here. It's and I can just talk of SKF's experience. What we've found is that we find quality issues mainly with small and medium-sized suppliers, and not so much with larger companies for obvious reasons. And it is those, and we have a whole bunch of tier 2, tier 3 suppliers who are SME industries. The problem is not the quality or localization. The problem is more generic than that. What are we doing about the MSME industry in India? It goes back to working capital, it goes back to management bandwidth, goes back to quality systems. It's a number of issues here. What we found worked really well for us is to be able to identify those critical suppliers in that MSME space and really impart to them the SKF knowledge. We've been in the country now for 70 years. We certainly have a way of doing things which has worked for us. And I think it was Samitra who said, have the humility to share with others. So what we found now is that the more we can share, and sometimes these could be fairly simple things. How do you manage working capital, for example? You know, how do you hire good people to manage quality? So it is you have to address the root of the problem and not the symptoms. And once you address the root of the problem, is that fix these issues, the end result is good quality, and that's a lagging indicator. But we found work with the leading indicators first, and it has worked well for us.
Okay, that's an interesting way to put it. One more question and we'll move on with our conversation. It says, what is the best option to set corrective forecasts which should not affect inventory, hold, and supply to OEM stroke customer? I want Anand, if you could take that. Do you think you'd like to take that, Anand?
Sure. So, Ashu, I think, again, I would like to answer it from a perspective of, the capability required, correct? I think for too long, we have been relying on processes which are people dependent. And largely from a data perspective, the internal structured data that have been there with the organizations as inputs to look at demand. And I think the way to start improving the understanding and of the demand and therefore the quality is to look at 2-3 things. One, I think from a people perspective, looking at demand planning as a capability and a skill that is there typically when you look at, and here many other industries like consumer and life sciences have a very structured cross-functional supply chain organization where demand planning is a more evolved function. So I think one, from a people skills perspective, ensuring that those skills are there. I think the second is really about harnessing all types of data, including external structured data, the industry reports, what's happening, the unstructured data, both internal and external, about what's happening in terms of social media and all of those things. And then really using the knowledge of the organization and this data points to see how some of those inputs can be better leveraged through technology. And I think the third is really feeding in a continuous process of what's learning and what's working and what's not working, because it will not be static. You'll always have to see if there is a system forecast which has been modified by the sales team with some logics. We do check back to see, what was better, what worked, what didn't work, and really use that information to keep making that better. So it's a combination of these processes that we'll have to start putting in place to eventually improve the understanding.
I would almost argue, Anand, that we may need to do away with people giving forecasts. There's got to be a better way of forecasting, whether it's transparency of data, optimization, connectivity, whatever it might be. And I've been working for 30 years now. I've never found a sales guy who's given a good forecast, COVID or no COVID. And maybe this is the time now to change something.
Yeah. Manish, I think completely agree with your end state. My continuous loop was more to manage the change part of it so that we have 6 months of data point to prove the obvious.
Yeah. And my sales guys will hate me for saying this, so I apologize in advance.
Raghu, sorry, you wanted to make a point. I missed that.
Yeah, actually, I wanted to go back to the point we were discussing earlier and specific question to maybe Soumitra and Ashwath, Manish, you as well. Just with all that's happening in the industry, and the whole new geopolitical environment and the geopolitics of also kicking in. How do your organizations see India on the whole supply chain map? Do you see the relative positioning of India as a business? You're already fairly sizable businesses in India. But do you see this as an opportunity for Bosch, Cummins, SKF, for all of you to look at India differently? What is emerging from your internal organizational conversations?
I can go first. From a Cummins perspective, like SKF and like Bosch, we've been in India for a long time. Cummins has been in India for over 60 years. And this has, helped us set up a lot of fundamental infrastructure within the country, a huge supply base. And what this has resulted in is that Cummins has 3 main manufacturing hubs around the world: in North America, in China, and in India. We have manufacturing in 150 countries around the world, but these 3 areas, US, India, and China, have emerged as the main manufacturing hub. And I would dare so far as to say that from an overall cost and quality perspective, India has an advantage. Like, we right now have something like a 10 to 15% cost advantage even from China. So this, if we can get our act together and do the things for which we've always had the potential, I think it opens up quite a bit of opportunity for us in India. But we will have to learn to play well with others. People hate a group of people who just want to export but won't import anything, or won't trade in a nice manner. So we've got to learn that if we keep an open mind and keep open borders and focus on trade, we can win because we have greater advantages as compared to other people.
Okay, so that.
If I go in.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, Ashutosh. So, I'll take on where Ashwath left off. If I take the Bosch example, we are 99 years young this year. Next year, we're going to celebrate with a purpose 100 years of Bosch in India. And the company itself is 136 years young. Now, rewiring the core is going to be absolutely essential, and that's what we're focusing on. And mobility is an important part of our business in India. And in mobility, I see mobility changing today to pace, personalized, and not autonomous now, automated and connected and electrified. Now, in India, if you add to pace, you have to put a software layer, which is the E architecture on top of it. So hardware, software, electronics, sensors all come together. And luckily for us, we have the largest R&D center in the world outside Germany, with 20,000 software engineers working both embedded and over the cloud. and with the Artificial Intelligence Center. There are 3 in the world, one of them located in India. Now, how do we play to that? The overarching point is innovation and affordability in India, and affordability underlined and bold. Now, if we put that in place, the big challenge that comes is not just the industry. We need to talk very openly, and we need to have an India agenda first, not a company agenda, which most companies are talking, not an industry agenda only, with the government. Talk at eye level and talk about both opportunities, nurture what is going well, and talk about the challenges openly. Many times in industry, I've seen we are too deferent, and sometimes we are also sometimes subservient. We need to have open talks, and not for our companies, again, I mentioned, but for the industry, and say, how do we see going forward? Alone, the industry and individual companies can do this much. And this is what I meant by obsessive collaboration with everyone, including the government of India. And it's not going to be a quick fix. There's no quick fix. We have to prepare the soil for the future. And lastly, we have to talk very openly about things which sometimes the world sees India differently. Does the world see India reliable? Then we need to have long-term constancy of policies and reforms. In some cases, we have good examples, in some cases not. And then we have to talk about basics like training. Take Germany. It takes 2 years for a florist to get her certificate. It takes 3 years for a plumber to get his certificate. Have we talked about the demographic dividend versus disaster looming in front of us? So there's some very basic, what I call as vital few and not the useful manys, which we together have to take forward. And of course, it's given that we have to work for our industry, and it's a bigger given that we have to keep our companies in shape.
Okay, that's a larger picture, but there's also the opportunity, since you mentioned about the agenda, that the way the rewiring of the supply chains can be done with the digital element to that, there is an opportunity for India to emerge as one of the leaders there. So since you mentioned about 100 years for Bosch, SKF also is going to be soon completing 100 years. Manish, how does that rewiring look like happening, and maybe quickened, if you can give some of those details that's happening, whatever can be shared?
Yeah, sure. And you're right. We've been 70 years in India, of course, 100 plus years globally. A lot of rewiring needs to happen in the way we work, in the way we go to market, in the way we deal with suppliers and customers. I do want to just take 30 seconds to respond to Ashwath and Sumitra on the previous question, Raghu.
Sure.
It is a little naive to think that India can replace China or even be the China +1 anytime in the future. What the supply chains that have been built up over decades is going to be impossible for a number of reasons. Ashwath and Sumitra have mentioned those, and there are many more. We are great thinkers. We are very poor doers. We love thinking about things, and we very rarely execute things well. It could be logistics, could be ports, could be whatever it is. So a lot of work needs to happen there in terms of making India this export hub that people are talking about. It is some time away. And I agree with Sumitra, we need to have a very candid conversation with the government, because things frankly need to move much faster in a much more consistent way, which we have not seen, despite many words and proclamations to that effect. Specifically, to come to Ashu, your question on how is SKF rewiring itself. Number one, first and foremost, what we're doing is that this electrification is a big deal. It's not a question of if it will happen, it's a question of when will it happen. And this will change us in the ways we cannot even imagine. And we have to look at the mobile revolution a decade or so ago, and I don't think we are fully prepared for it from a supply chain perspective. We are not. We may think we are not. I'll give an example. Automotive companies, if they go fully electric, they will no longer need steel, but they will need ceramic in their bearings. Now, ceramic is a very difficult raw material to procure and then to convert into a usable product. It's not the ceramic used in teacups. It's a little bit more advanced than that. And so the way we are rewiring ourselves is to go beyond. We've been a steel sourcing company for 100 years. and that made the bulk of our raw material. Now, suddenly we're being asked to go and source ceramic or who knows what else. There could be new ways of lubricating, new ways of sealing, new ways of reducing friction. So we really have to have the ability, the capability to look around the corner much, much more better than we have done in the past, because the corner is moving very, very fast. Sometimes even before we can get to that corner to look around, the corner has moved goalposts. So it's extremely important in the way we are looking at intelligence, we're looking at data, we're looking at trends, and the old way of doing things. And again, we are frankly struggling with this whole compression of time. The whole planning of 5 years and 3 year strat plans is absolutely not relevant anymore. How can we get more data, more good data, reliable data, efficient data, and look at sources beyond our traditional sources to figure out what's going to change? And the problem with legacy companies like Bosch and maybe Cummins, and certainly for us, is that we are so risk averse. We need reams and reams of information because that's what worked well for us in the past. And that's going to change. We have to behave a lot more like startups. And that, of course, is much easier said than done. So it's a transformation in progress at SKF. Not easy, but we are working very hard to learn and get there.
Okay, so one of the ways it has been is what Atul Thakkar referred to earlier in terms of reaching out to areas which are remote, which probably have not been accessed by some companies. So what are the challenges you face, Atul, in reaching out to some of them in terms of the sheer reach of the supply chain that you need to execute regularly?
Ashu, basically my heroes are the e-commerce companies, because while we have a B2B vertical, we also have a B2C vertical. And what I've realized is the way the food delivery guys or the e-commerce companies have leveraged the data. I mean, they use advanced analytics, they use AI, they use predictive analysis. And imagine you order a dish every Friday, the third or fourth Friday, you would get, all those messages, this dish from this restaurant, the same from some other, the way they are predicting our behavior. I mean, the algorithms they use. So, I mean, as a joke, we deliver toners to our customers. We sell multifunction printers and production printers. So typically the timeline is, 24 hours. And during lockdown, because of the warehouses not working or we could not source immediately, the customers would, laugh and say, yeah, we get a pizza in 30 minutes. Aapko 24 ghanta lag raha hai. So that's the competition which we are facing in the B2C part. And while we are utilizing all the data points, you get so many off-the-shelf cloud programs which we can plug in. We really need to work hard on it. And as I say, I use the term heroes the way because I would like to learn more from them. The way they are able to analyze and leverage the data. One thing which I found was, Ashu, is while we all, the panelists, are procuring from international sources, the e-commerce guys typically are on local sourcing and local delivery. So for them, that is an advantage. And not taking away the work they have done, but at least they have an advantage where they don't have to source internationally. So at least that part is easy for them. But yes, I agree with you. And as I said, those 130,000 post officers have really taught me a lot about how to, and sometimes we do use Jugaad, the Indian version of non-traditional ways of delivering things to meet our SLAs. But yes, those challenges are there, and I look at the e-commerce companies to learn and improve ourselves.
Okay, so one of the things that has been discussed or raised has been about how EVs or electric vehicles are going to make a difference, and the entire industry is going to impact and change supply chains as well. So Raghu, how do you see the emergence of EVs impacting future supply chains, particularly at automotive OEMs as well as suppliers?
Yeah. So Manish, I think briefly touched upon it. I think we are still scratching the surface to figure figure out how EVs are going to dramatically alter the supply chain landscape. I think it's a game that's still being understood. Having said that, I think most of our panelists here and most incumbent players in the industry, whether it's the OEMs or the suppliers, have had long established sophisticated operations, in vehicle production, component production, supply chains, supplier management. They know how to manufacture components, build cars, and have the supply chains to do it. But now, emergence of EVs, they need to look at balancing the simultaneous, if I may say so, development and production of ICE or internal combustion engine powered vehicles and electric vehicles. This requires developing EV battery or other components of powertrain partners while continuing to foster relationships with the current powertrain suppliers. If you look at some of the new entrants coming in, they face a more daunting task. They have the technology possibly that's essential to build components that go into EVs, and maybe also a culture of innovation that enables them to continuously push their thinking. But what they need to develop is an entirely new supply chain from scratch as compared to many of our incumbents. And they've taken decades. And like you heard Soumitra, SKF, and Manish talk about both Bosch and SKF, they've been around, for more than 100 years. It's taken them decades. So any new supplier coming in, it's not going to be easy to get all of those supply chains in place. And if you look at what are companies doing to enable this transition, I think both the incumbents as well as new entrants somewhere need to take a call on, how are they going to go about it? Will they manufacture? Will they buy? Who are the new constellation of suppliers or ecosystem of suppliers that they need to partner with? And steel has been a big part of the sourcing plan for tens of years. How do you move away from steel, other components that are going to become more important in the EV paradigm? So I think developing a supply strategy for that, coming up with a short-term and a long-term strategy, whether it's battery or other components, how do you put in place a plan which is going to take you, from where you are today, the component base that you have today, to the component base of the future. Developing a localization strategy for components. So again, that's a big part of what you need to do as you look at scaling up your game in the EV side. Securing supply for critical materials, and there is already a battle and a war on in resource-rich countries to secure some of the raw material that needs to be looked at. I think reimagining in some sense the metrics that go into supplier management and risk management. And again, most of the giants or incumbents already have well-established processes. And then finally, I think, as we move into EVs, a big part of a big question that everybody is grappling with is sustainability. How do you ensure battery recycling is done in a consistent, cost-effective, and environmentally conscious manner? So again, that's also a big part of the challenge that the industry is going to see as you move more and more of the share towards EVs, and so that's the other big thing. So these are, I think, 6 or 7 things that come top of mind in terms of how EVs are likely to impact the future supply chains in the industry.
Soumitra, the conversation also is about changing the culture in building the new digital supply chain. How difficult is it for a company that has such a rich history, very successful at that, and now is having to change in keeping with the times?
I think it's a fantastic question, Ashutosh. If I just take an additional minute to talk about what we heard about EVs, in Bosch, we started the EV journey about 12 years ago. The company till today worldwide has invested more than 5 billion euros. And by 2025, our global CEO has also said in public domain, so I can share it, that we would have a turnover of 5 billion euros from EV alone, powertrains. And the acquired orders till now is 20 billion. So just gives you an idea that also companies sometimes move ahead. Now, if I take the matter EV in India, we are not going to be US, we are not going to be Germany, and we are not going to be China. Ashwath most probably would agree that 80% of 2030 would still be IC. So we have to first understand the landscape in India and the rest of the world. Now, having said that, if I take your question and link it to EV or traditional supply chain areas, very important is not the siloed effect on digital supply chain. Many times we talk digital, but it's siloed. Take the example of source, make, deliver. Many times, even good companies have greater emphasis on make, but then we have to keep the source and the deliver because they are one together. The second part of the supply chain is not internally only within the company, the digital, the linkage to the customer. And here, I think, while many of us work with OEMs, we still have a long way together from both sides to be transparent, where our ERP systems are talking to each other online and not a buffer system of offline and then coming online. Again, because that doesn't bring transparency or online transactions. And lastly, the MSME delta. In India, we face this huge challenge of the massive delta between tier 1 and then the tier 2s and the MSMEs. Totally different from countries like Germany. So in summary, I would say EV is going to make it more complicated because for every 10 people who work for diesel or 3 people for gasoline, you need 1 person for EV, number 1. Number 2, the components are going to be different and far lesser. And number 3, as Manish rightly said, we're talking of a different set of raw materials for the components. So in summary, again, I would say it's not an easy answer. It's not only looking at internally, it's looking at externally, high levels of dependence, and then transitioning from ICE to EV, is going to be a massive challenge. And this is something that's going to be really looking forward. Both from, I end with, there are sharks playing, the big companies, and there are piranhas playing, the new startups, who come from the software background and not from the hard. And then the sharks and the piranhas will have to play together.
Okay, my same question to Ashwath as well about the culture part of it. How are companies looking to ensure that? How is maybe Cummins looking to do that, and in India specifically, so that it could get you ready for tomorrow?
Yeah, I'm going to try to answer this just from the supply chain perspective, because when I try to answer it from a strategy perspective or a overall culture perspective, it's slightly different. So from a supply chain perspective, one of the major trends which Raghu also spoke about is that as you migrate from technology which has been in existence for over 100 years and has been a very stable kind of technology, literally the entire industry ran on one technology. And so there has been a consistent supply base. There has been, time and ability for an entire supply chain to evolve and develop. Now, what's going to happen as you try to transition from one supply chain to a different supply chain whose story is not clear yet? So it's not yet clear that, that battery electric vehicle, which is the most popular vehicle, currently, is the guaranteed winner in this. So there is going to be a phase of highly disruptive period in the next 15 to 20 years where these different technologies will, play out. And that is also a time when there is going to be a lot of consolidation happening, which means in the space earlier, if there were 50 manufacturers of, diesel-based technology, is going to drop down to 10. And similarly, when you have, 300,000 suppliers, it may drop down to 40,000. So this concept of consolidation has already started. And we are seeing this as a very big change. Now, what that means is people who you used to consider your competitors are now no longer your competitors. They are your partners, and they are your, they are part of your supply chain, and which means companies are going to have to, as a culture, learn to be incredibly flexible. That means not only work with the supply chain they have been working with, but take somebody else's supply chain and also integrate that simultaneously, while a entirely different team is looking out in parallel to create a new supply chain in a very fuzzy area, which is not yet known who the winners are going to be or what is the technology that is going to win. It's not clear that whether hydrogen is going to be more successful or batteries are going to be more successful, and that's going to take 30, 40 years to play out. And in this time, companies, the culture they're going to have to develop, and what we are working on is to say, how do we be more flexible? How do we integrate better? How do we play better? How do we work with people we have never worked with before? How do we look at supply chain consolidation? Like there may be certain components like castings, which no country wants to produce. So can India be a consolidator in some of those spaces? So I think those are all the types of options which will open up, and you have to have a mindset which is what I call a growth mindset, which means the ability to learn very quickly, to adapt, to change, to be very flexible, to move on a dime and make progress. So I would say that would be the best way we would look at it.
Okay, so good time to ask Anand then. Anand, so what are the factors, success factors that you'd like to say that could help plan the digital supply chain journey for a company?
Yeah, sure. I think very interesting, and I'll probably answer this question more from the digital and the technology lens, because I think from an industry lens, I think all the panelists have given a lot of perspectives on the strategic decisions that need to be sorted. But when you look at it from a digital perspective, therefore, and we spoke about rewiring earlier, right? I think a lot of companies are currently on a mix of a lot of legacy systems through their parents, through acquisitions. There's a lot of manual systems and a whole host of point solutions that exist, correct? And therefore, if we have to respond and go into this era of greater agility, collaboration, being able to leverage data better, I think what we need to look at first, what we call as a living architecture. I think what we mean by living architecture is really there are 2-3 components which are core here. One is really the digital core, which is the ERP. We are all, a lot of organizations are in the process of planning or have started their journeys to migrating their cores, assuming most of them use SAP. So how do you first set that right? What are the things that you would want to use that for, and not using a lift and shift approach, and really looking at that as a real opportunity to transform. So that's really the core of where all the data would reside in a big way, at least the organization data. I think the second layer is really the connected solution, the platform which will enable a lot of these things to happen, which are all your end-to-end planning and supply chain execution platforms, which will enable your capabilities of faster response, daily, weekly planning, what if scenarios, etc. And you have multiple such platforms available in the market, which will really connect all the stakeholders, internal, external, and do a lot of these capabilities. And the third is really the innovation engines. So there are a lot of point solutions today available in the market. For supplier risk, there are solutions which are plug and play, where you really can real-time sense what's happening with your tier 3 supplier if a particular event is triggered, and so on and so forth. I mean, there's a whole ecosystem there, and these technologies will evolve. So one needs to build a clear picture of what would be plug and play, what would be the core platform on which we would want to build this core capabilities, and how would it all talk to the digital core. And once we have that digital, the architecture envisaged to respond, I think then comes the part of journey planning, correct, in terms of the success factors. And I think here, obviously, there is an element, obviously, all the panelists would look at this from a P&L perspective and ROI perspective, right? What we have also seen is a lot of organizations look at it as a mix of the traditional financial metrics to drive these journeys, but also look at this as capability-led benefits. Because what we are seeing in this uncertainty, these capabilities being required, would mean a lot of things that we may or may not be able to quantify in hard terms today, in terms of how they will benefit. But they would be important to ensure that we run a event-free or a significantly risk-reduced stable supply chain continuously. Obviously there are benefits of productivity, efficiency, agility, of able to capture a opportunity in the market, which would be difficult for you to quantify if you're sitting with the traditional means of finding out the ROI for such kind of investments, right? So one is really having a balance of financial and capability-led benefits, and then the organization readiness of people, process, and more importantly, data. I think that really drives how we would want to plan these journeys out in a very structured manner. I think everybody on the panel is really the sponsor of this initiative, so I won't emphasize the obvious. They're already very clear that this is a very high priority agenda. So those are the 2-3 things I would say are the success factors.
Okay, let's also, please, Atul, you may want.
Ashu, 2 minutes. What I feel is the new trend of ESG investing, wherein companies are being pressured to reduce their carbon emissions, and which is happening in the manufacturing side. But I think in the next 2-3 years, the pressure will build on the supply chain side, and that I'm still grappling how it will play out. What will be the pressure on us to reduce our carbon emissions, because the ESG way of investing has picked up, and a lot of mutual funds across the globe, especially in Europe, are now going by that ESG methodology to invest. So I think that is one thing which the pressure will come in the next 2-3 years, and which will disrupt our supply chains and increase our cost in the initial phase. So we'll have to keep a track of that.
Okay, some quick questions that we should take. Prashant mostly has a question, and maybe Soumitra may want to answer. How do we tackle future EV waste while we're talking of the EV industry? Has there been enough thought?
So I would answer it in 2 parts, first generic and then to Bosch. Generic, if we take India, we are at a very nascent stage. And as some of the panelists already mentioned, we are also at a nascent stage on the matter electrification today. Yeah. And we have to find the way forward, both from regulatory, from demand, and of course, finally from affordability. And the waste matter is right now right at the, I would say in the middle or the end of the pipeline on the whole story, which is relatively infant. On the international front, I would say, and we just heard about ESG, there have been quite a bit of discussions. And I would say, relatively speaking, again, advanced countries have processes, rules, which are far more advanced. So in summary, I would say India will have to learn on copy with pride. ESG matter, we will have to bring about, in my view, a lot of consciousness. For example, in Bosch, worldwide, we are carbon neutral, worldwide, across Bosch, and in India since September last year. But these are choices that companies have to take, and these choices will come at a cost. And then it comes with corporate governance. The walk the talk rather than talk the walk. So I would say very important is A, individual companies take recognition, B, industry takes on, including the matter waste, and then of course processes, including statutory and regulatory norms being formed. Starting point, currently infancy. In Bosch, we have a very clear policy worldwide across for not just this waste, but also for other issues like this, including for the whole aspect on a closed loop manner for electrification.
Okay, so there's another question from M. Sivasubramaniam, and maybe Raghu, you may want to answer that. How does a company look at digital technology investment in supply chain management? He's referring to the manufacturing sector. Is it seen as an expenditure or an asset? It's a very broad question again, but it's about that mindset.
Yeah. So, we've seen two kinds of approaches companies have looked at when it comes to digital technologies. I think one, the first approach is the more classical approach, where I think you start with creating a vision document or a blueprint, which lays out, how you are going to go about investing in these technologies. What are the big value levers that you'll try and target? Whether they're on the revenue side or on the cost side, that digital technologies can influence, and what are the actual solutions you'll deploy and how you'll deploy them. So I think that's the more classical approach, which is more, I would say, the blueprint or strategy led. So that's one approach, and it will mean investments upfront with the ROI to follow. The other approach that we've seen companies take is really look at more focused solutions. There is a specific business problem identified. There is a problem statement. There is a value that has been identified, value pocket. And then you focus on just solving for that problem and delivering that value and using that impact to again then look at the next set of problems. The value you are trying to generate or accrue from that specific problem. And then you look at reinvesting that. So I think those are two different approaches. So I would say, the specific answer to the question, it will remain an asset, but you can make this a self-funding journey.
Okay, another question. There's another question from Abhishek Luthra, slightly longer in terms of the content that he's written. E-commerce companies, especially in auto and auto ancillaries, behave like one more channel, which is opening up the large SKU portfolio for customers to choose from. Now, this puts pressure back on OEMs to manage range, speed, and if this is directly fulfilled by OEM, then on logistics as well. That's what he writes. How do you think companies can leverage this? Manish, can I toss this one to you?
Yeah, actually, I had raised my hand for the previous question, but nevertheless.
Oh, okay. Please.
Now, if you don't mind, I'll answer the previous question and add to what was said. And I don't want to get into the accounting discussion, whether it's an expenditure or an asset. Let the finance guys take care of that. It's more about digital technologies, tools, and digital supply chain, etc. Before I joined SKF, I used to play golf. Now I have no time. But and I had a very bad swing. And investing in new digital tools and new technologies to fix a broken supply chain is like buying new golf clubs to fix a bad swing. It won't work. So I think we sometimes get too enamored of the new tools and technologies and everything else. And very often we have to fix the basics in place. And Ashu, you were onto a good track when you were talking of culture earlier on. Digital supply chain is more than the tools, technologies, demand forecasting. It's about the culture. And I think at some point in time, we have to have a much larger discussion on it's a very different animal. And us middle-aged men on the Zoom call probably don't appreciate the need of this change of culture as much as we should. So I like the question, but my advice to all the questioners here is that go beyond the tools and technologies. It's a big cultural change you need to drive any digitalization, including digital supply chains. So focus on that, and certainly don't listen to old people like us.
Okay. Well, that's quite. So would you like to also take that, the other question? I'll just try and summarize that question. He says that e-commerce companies, this is Abhishek Luthra's question, behave like one more channel, and this puts pressure on OEMs to manage range, speed, and if this is directly fulfilled by OEMs, then on logistics as well. So his question is, how do you think companies can leverage this?
Well, it's like any other. Are you asking me, or is it?
Yeah, please. Yeah, please, Mitch.
I was going to say it's like any other new channel to go to market. One should not be so caught up in it's new. It's how do OEMs react, like they would react to any other competition. It is no different, and whatever applies there also applies here. So don't get too stuck up on whether it's an e-commerce company or direct to a mechanic or direct to a workshop. That's not important here. What's important here is focus on competition.
Okay, Ashwath has also raised his hand. Ashwath.
Yeah. All I would add to what Manish was saying is that you look at it as a market segment. You try to understand what the needs of that customer are. So if the needs of that customer are, shorter loads or lighter loads, shorter distances, faster turnaround, then you have to gear your products to meet those requirements. So you can't design one product which fits for all markets anymore. So you have to design for the application. You have to understand the needs of that end market. You have to understand what is most important to them, and then design your supply chain, design your product to be able to meet that segment's requirement. And yes, you'll be successful.
Okay, got it. I think we've almost run out of time, so maybe good time to request Anand Darbe to do closing remarks, please. Anand?
Yeah, thanks, Ashu. I think it's been a fascinating 90 minutes of conversation. So I think a sincere thank you to all the panelists. I think we spoke of a broad range of issues. I think starting by acknowledging that the traditional supply chain, the way we understand, is dead. We are moving from linear to much more dynamic and interconnected supply chain. I think we spoke of the fact that all the other strategic challenges the industry is facing, I think are going to impact supply chain very fundamentally, and supply chain will also be a very, very key component of the solutions that organizations find to address those challenges and opportunities. And I think in doing that, the next few years will be all about how do we make our current and existing supply chains a lot more agile, responsive, and move away from the efficiency-oriented mindsets that we had, while building newer supply chains for the shifts which electrification and other disruptions are building in place. We also spoke of the fact that collaboration is a very, very key part of this. Organizations should actively look at partnering, both upstream with suppliers, with customers, and with a whole host of partners with whom would bring in those technologies. And at this stage, it will be very difficult for any organization to invest in and do all of those things themselves. And we also spoke of culture, that any transformation like this that we speak is not going to succeed unless we sort of make the people realize the importance and carry the people along in this journey, and really make them successful, as I think we spoke, that's typically the root cause of success or failure, whichever way you look at it, right? So I think it's been a fascinating set of insights. On behalf of Accenture, I really like to thank everyone for this wonderful conversation, and look forward to more such engaging sessions as we go ahead. Ashish, thanks so much for keeping us on point and honest during the last 90 minutes.
Thank you so much, everyone, for your time. And indeed, it was an engaging discussion. And the culture point kind of just has stuck in my head since I heard it. And also the point about, the country and industry coming together to decide the road ahead. That could be a tectonic shift if we can execute that as well. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us. Wonderful speaking to you. And for the viewers, look forward to being with you again on such interesting discussions.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye then.
Bye. Bye.